I walked away from it well over a decade. You know what I'm saying? You could, in a lot of ways, you could say two.
He was hip-hop's first knock on America's living room door. More than just a pioneering rapper, LL Cool J is one of the rare multi-talented artists whose career has endured for over 4 decades. A figure who helped take hip-hop off the streets and onto award stages, television screens, and into mainstream culture. But maintaining that spotlight took more than just talent, it required a fighter's spirit. Because behind the stage lights, LL wasn't just battling musical rivals, he was confronting former friends, old allies, and even disillusioned fans. His success has been a constant uphill climb, challenged by doubt, betrayal, and periods of isolation within the very culture he helped create. Now at 57, LL Cool J is revealing for the first time the 7 artists he genuinely couldn't stand, not just out of ego, but because they crossed lines he found unforgivable. This video series will take you through each conflict, 7 raw chapters of pride principle, and the loneliness of being a living legend. Each episode asks tough questions about fame, legacy, and the price of never compromising. Are you ready to step inside the real world behind the Kangol hat and iconic gold chain? Hit subscribe, click like, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss these untold truths. MC Hammer and the First Fracture. In 1988, at the height of American pop culture's obsession with spectacle, an unexpected musical phenomenon exploded MC Hammer. With electrifying dance moves, flamboyant outfits, and pop-infused hits like You Can't Touch, this 1990 Hammer became an undeniable icon. He wasn't just a rapper, he was a television star, a national spokesperson, a man who sold over 50 million records worldwide, an almost unheard-of feat for a hip-hop artist at that time. Meanwhile, LL Cool J, then in his early 20s, was on a very different path: rap. As Street Declaration, raw identity, and unfiltered truth. That gap between two worlds: on one side, the roaring crowds of stadiums. On the other, the dark alleys where art is forged in survival, became stark. When Hammer casually mentioned LL in a verse on his 1988 track, Let's Get It Started, it wasn't a diss. If anything, it may have been a nod of respect. But to LL, who was raised on a code where respect wasn't given lightly, every mention held weight. He didn't react immediately, but 2 years later in his Mama Syed Knock You Out album, LL dropped Boomin' System, firing off lines mocking Hammer's glitzy image, a message not meant for the crowd, but for a single person. And just like that, the tension began. There were no punches, no official diss tracks, but LL's discomfort seeped into how he referenced Hammer, portraying him more as a mainstream mascot than a true artist. In a later interview, LL vaguely commented, "I got no problem with Hammer. I just did what I had to do." Perhaps it was a clever dodge, or maybe a mask for deeper frustration. Because what pained LL wasn't Hammer himself, but how the industry was starting to redefine hip-hop success. Not through bars, but through ticket sales, endorsement deals, and choreographed routines. LL's response wasn't loud. It was a prolonged silence laced with cool distance and quiet disappointment. For him, every time a street-bred artist had to sit back and watch the spotlight handed to someone with flashier outfits, it felt like more than rejection. It felt like erasure. The fading wasn't caused by a fellow rapper, but by a culture he had once seen as sacred, now being rewritten under stage lights. But the story here isn't about jealousy. The unspoken tension between LL and Hammer marked the first visible crack in hip-hop's late 80s cultural fabric, the growing divide between authenticity and accessibility. To LL, who had written Rock the Bells as an anthem against dilution, seeing Hammer on national TV in shiny suits was a sign hip-hop was losing its soul, or at least entering a gray area where the old rules no longer applied. Over time, LL stopped referring to Hammer as an adversary, not out of surrender, but out of understanding. Because as he watched newer generations, Jay-Z, Drake, Kanye build empires that blurred lines between artist mogul and cultural icon, LL had to confront a truth: maybe Hammer wasn't a detour, but a preview. A signal that the future of hip-hop wasn't just lyrical, it was multidimensional. And so that first quiet clash, though not explosive, turned out to be the most prophetic. It foreshadowed deeper wounds LL would face in years to come. Not wounds from lyrics, but from watching himself become a stranger in a culture evolving beyond him. And the next blow would come not from a verse, but from a fellow performer, one with just as much charisma and even sharper edges, Jamie Foxx. Jamie Foxx and the Fracture in Pride. In 1999, director Oliver Stone launched Any Given Sunday, a football film with a powerhouse cast: Al Pacino, Cameron Diaz, Dennis Quaid, Jamie Foxx, and LL Cool J. This wasn't a lyrical battle, this was a different kind of arena, where physicality, ego, and performance collided. LL took on the role of Julian Washington, a flashy, arrogant star running back, while Jamie Foxx played Willie Beeman, a rebellious and ambitious rookie. Ironically, when the director yelled "action," the tension between their characters didn't stop on screen. One sweltering afternoon on set in Florida, amid dozens of heavy hits and intense dialogue, the line between performance and reality began to blur. LL, known for immersing himself fully into roles, became too real. He yelled not just during takes, but between them too. Jamie Foxx, a sharp and emotionally intuitive artist, didn't see this as dedication, but as disrespect. Then, the unexpected happened. During a physical scene, Jamie suddenly punched LL square in the face. It wasn't scripted, there was no rehearsal. It was instinct, or more accurately, the breaking point of pride. Chaos erupted on set. Filming halted. A fight broke out between the two stars in front of the entire crew. LL didn't go down. He hit back. And in that short but heavy moment, LL's entire world built on control composure, and the image of a trailblazer was shaken. Not by the punch itself, but by what it symbolized: a public challenge from a peer in an arena where LL couldn't dominate with lyrics or stage presence. Later, when asked about the incident, Jamie Foxx took a humorous tone, calling it two big kids fighting, then shaking hands. LL, on the other hand, stayed mostly silent. But through every expression, every dodge in conversation, it became clear this wasn't just a scuffle, it cut deep. For LL, the stage, whether in music or film, was a space of authority. And when someone disrupted that rhythm with a fist, it wasn't just a personal altercation, it was a direct blow to his sense of self. What made this conflict particularly striking wasn't its violence, but its contrast: two black men, both successful, both driven by pride and a need for validation, colliding from different worlds. One came from the stage of comedy and cinema, building his career with charm and finesse. The other from the tough streets of Queens, New York, carrying the weight of a turbulent childhood and songs that spoke for the forgotten. Their clash wasn't about lines of dialogue, it was about values. But the truth is, when ego meets ego, no one truly wins. Jamie wasn't seen as the stronger man, and LL couldn't erase the crack in the image he had worked so hard to craft. They never worked together again. No joint projects, no red carpets, no backstage selfies, but also no further shots fired. Just two paths diverging, each man carrying a lesson of his own. And if Jamie's punch wounded LL's sense of personal control, the next blow would cut deeper into his core values. It would question his loyalty, his pride, and the very foundation of his legacy, ushered in by a rising new generation, led by none other than Jay-Z. Jay-Z and the Unnamed Shadow. In the 1980s, LL Cool J was the first young icon to bring hip-hop into the living rooms of millions of American families. He wasn't just the first artist signed to Def Jam, he was the reason many people even knew about the label. With hits like Rock the Bells and I Need Love LL, became the face of an entire generation. Among that generation was a boy from Brooklyn sitting in front of a TV learning how to hold a mic by watching LL Sean Carter, better known as Jay-Z. Jay-Z once openly expressed admiration for LL. Early in his career, he often performed I Need Love as a tribute. LL knew this, and he smiled. He recognized that familiar look in a younger man's eyes, the same look he once had when watching Run DMC or Cool Moe Dee. But time passed. Jay-Z grew up. No longer the apprentice, Jay became a global phenomenon, not just a rapper, but a producer-entrepreneur, and in 2004 was appointed president of Def Jam. That was a turning point LL never saw coming. LL was still on the Def Jam roster, still making music, still preparing new albums. He expected support, at least from someone who once called him an idol. But instead, LL felt pushed aside. In a 2007 episode of Behind the Music, he said bluntly, "I needed my album promoted, but I didn't think he had the ability to do that." Beneath that disappointment was pain, the pain of being the foundation only to suddenly be viewed as past his time. While Jay-Z poured energy into rising stars like Rihanna and Nayo, with great success, LL found himself stuck with underpromoted releases. It wasn't just a commercial battle, it was the feeling of being replaced. What had once made LL special, his seriousness, passion, and rugged yet polished style no longer seemed to align with modern tastes. The cruel irony, the one shaping that new direction, was his former student. Jay-Z never responded publicly. He remained quiet, polite, or cautious. They stood side by side at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2021, smiling for the cameras. But just a year later, during the Force Tour, LL unexpectedly declared, "All you rappers trying to act legendary, get your ass up on this damn stage." The crowd erupted. Many understood it was an unnamed call-out, and LL didn't need to specify who it was for. To Jay-Z, perhaps it was old news. But for LL, it was a wound that hadn't healed. Not because he was forgotten, but because he was misunderstood. LL was never just a rapper. He was an era. And when that era is reduced to archive, he didn't respond with a diss track. He responded with inner conflict. Older generations are often mistaken for being bitter, but sometimes they're just trying to protect what they built with blood, sweat, and youth. LL doesn't hate Jay-Z. He's just hurt by seeing himself turned into a bust in a hip-hop museum that's too eager to expand. And if Jay-Z's silence made LL feel invisible, then his next confrontation would make him feel outright rejected, publicly, forcefully, not by a record executive, but by someone who once idolized him, only to turn against him over one lyric. That someone was Cool Moe Dee. Cool Moe Dee, the old guard, clinging to the stage. In 1987, LL Cool J was just 19 years old. Fresh off the roaring success of his album Bigger and Deffer, he rapped bold lines like "I'm only 18 and already own a home." A proud, defiant boast from a young man who had turned rap into a career-achieving success far beyond what anyone had imagined. While millions of young fans saw LL as the embodiment of a new dream for some in the previous generation, those words struck a nerve right in the heart of old-school pride. Cool Moe Dee was one of those legends. As a member of the Treacherous Three, Moe Dee had helped lay the foundation for what would later be known as battle rap, where words were weapons and pride was the battlefield. He was a symbol of a time when rap was rebellion, not industry. So when he heard a teenage rapper claim to make more money than your fathers, he didn't see it as triumph. He saw it as a deviation. To Moe Dee, LL had crossed a line. Rap wasn't supposed to flaunt wealth. Success shouldn't be measured by cars or property. Rap in Moe Dee's world was about cultural message and communal legacy. And so, in late 1987, he released How You Like Me Now, an album that fired back not just with lyrics, but with imagery. The cover said it all, a red Kangol hat, LL's signature accessory crushed beneath a Jeep tire. LL couldn't let it go unanswered. He fired back with Jack the Ripper, a sharp, swaggering diss track mocking Moe Dee's age and style. And again in To the Break of Dawn, 1990, where LL didn't just clap back, he challenged an entire philosophy. In a confident cutting flow, he rejected the scolding tone of the older generation, accusing Moe Dee of clinging to a spotlight that had long since faded and refusing to accept that the times had changed. The feud stretched over 3 years, becoming one of the first truly iconic beefs in hip-hop history. But behind every diss was a deeper insecurity. Moe Dee feared being forgotten, and LL feared being dismissed. They weren't just two rappers, they were two eras, one rooted in tradition, the other convinced that evolution was inevitable. Eventually, the tension faded. In later years, both LL and Moe Dee spoke of each other with measured respect. LL acknowledged Moe Dee's pioneering role. Moe Dee admitted LL's talent and cultural impact, but the distance remained. It wasn't a warm resolution, but a cool truce, like two old soldiers who once stood on opposite ends of the battlefield, now offering each other a nod from across the room. Ice-T, a mirror to the self, not every conflict in LL. Cool J's life began with a rap line. Some arrived quietly, like someone watching from afar, choosing not to come any closer. Ice-T was that kind of presence. In 1988, Ice-T released I'm Your Pusher, a track steeped in resistance to the creeping materialism starting to infiltrate hip-hop. No names were mentioned, but the message was clear. It was a subtle, biting jab at artists who were morphing from street storytellers into magazine cover models. And at that time, few represented hip-hop's glamorized image more than LL Cool J. With his pursed lips, gold chains, tilted Kangol, and booming rhymes about cars, cash, and charisma. LL didn't respond immediately, but he heard it. He always did. And as usual, when he felt targeted, he answered in the only language he knew: best beats and bars. On To Break of Dawn, 1990, a track where he also took shots at Cool Moe Dee and MC Hammer, LL dropped a few unnamed lines sharp enough for Ice-T to know he hadn't been overlooked. It wasn't fiery or explicit like the later East Coast-West Coast beefs, but it left a scratch small, unspoken, and persistent. Ice-T, contrary to his often combative persona, didn't respond with a diss track. He opted for dialogue. Years later, he recounted a quiet moment they shared at a television summit. No cameras, no press. Just two men who had quietly bristled at each other for over a decade, now standing face to face. Ice extended a hand. "You know we've never actually talked." LL shook it. No long explanations, no apologies. That's how men who fought with pride make peace. Not through reasons, but through recognition that they're cut from the same cloth. Raw, stubborn, principled. This wasn't a typical beef. No one won. No track went platinum on the back of a feud. But if you looked deeper, the tension between LL and Ice-T reflected one of the clearest cultural splits of their generation: image versus authenticity. LL, born of hip-hop's rise into mass entertainment, understood that art needed an audience. Ice-T, raised in the volatile streets of Los Angeles, never trusted art packaged in stage lights. They stood in contrast, but not in hatred. And maybe that's why their conflict never exploded into scandal. Instead, it became a dialogue through music, glances, and silence. LL didn't change his style, but he began to realize that not every critic was an enemy. Ice-T never mirrored LL, but he didn't deny LL's role in paving hip-hop's path to the mainstream. Time moved on. Ice-T became a TV icon through Law & Order SVU. LL followed suit with NCIS Los Angeles. Two men who once faced opposite directions now shared the same screen. Less rhymes, more silence. The question was never who was right or wrong. The question was, in a culture always shifting between real and performed, how do you hold on to who you truly are? Wyclef Jean, a friend with heart, but lacking depth. Some conflicts come from places you never expect. Not from rivals, not from elders, and not from someone vying for the spotlight, but from a friend. Someone who once raised a glass with you backstage, praised you both publicly and privately. Someone who seemed to stand beside you until one day, you hear your name in a track. Not in tribute, but as a target. LL Cool J knew that feeling all too well when Wyclef Jean's name suddenly emerged in the orbit of a diss record that didn't even belong to him. In the late 1990s, LL was still an unshakable icon. Despite changing trends in rap-conscious lyrics, neo-soul underground sounds, he remained part of hip-hop's mainstream identity. Wyclef Jean, the Haitian-born former Fugees member, represented another wave, a fusion of intellect and globalism, blending reggae funk and political rap. There was no real beef between them, no shots fired, no envy. But as LL once said, "A deep wound doesn't always bleed." No one remembers exactly where the diss began, a freestyle, a veiled line, a cryptic metaphor. Fans whispered that Wyclef had played a role in a track dissing LL. It wasn't direct, but to those watching closely, the message was loud enough. When asked, Wyclef brushed it off. "That's hip-hop. Everyone mentions everyone. I admire LL." Maybe he meant it. But for LL, it wasn't that simple. He didn't lash out. No diss track in return. No angry interviews. But in a few rare live freestyles or radio appearances, LL dropped lines, brief, sharp, nameless, but pointed enough for fans to connect the dots. That's how LL operated, never spiteful, but never forgetful. Especially when the words came from someone who once called him inspiration. What hurt LL wasn't the song itself. It was the casual logic behind it. The idea that in the name of freedom of expression, every jab could be called art. For LL, loyalty was sacred. To contribute to a diss track, even as a writer or producer, wasn't something that could be explained away with. It's just rap. That's where their paths split. The distance wasn't loud, but it was cold. No beef aired, no onstage reunion. They simply drifted like two subway lines in the same city, never crossing tracks again. Until one winter day in 2000, at the funeral of rapper Big Pun, they met face to face. A handshake, not a reconciliation, not forgiveness, but closure. Those present said they stood silently, eyes locked, hands firm, then turned and walked away. It wasn't healing. It wasn't redemption. It was acceptance that sometimes two people can both love hip-hop but no longer share the same circle of values. LL never needed anyone to take his side, but he always paid attention to who didn't. The pain from Wyclef didn't come from its intensity, but from expectation. It didn't shatter LL's image, but it made him retreat. He grew cautious, guarded. In a world where trust could be traded for a few clever bars, LL learned the hardest truth. The person who cuts you deepest isn't always trying to beat you. Sometimes they just don't understand the wound they've left behind. But if that kind of wound made LL go quiet, the next conflict would force him to roar, not for ego, but for honor. When a young rapper dared to touch the one thing LL held most sacred: legacy. With one seemingly harmless line, Canibus sparked the fiercest lyrical war of LL's career. A battle that, as LL admitted, was the most personal of all. Because this time, it wasn't a game, it was his legacy. Canibus, the no-holds-barred battle. Sometimes a legacy isn't threatened by someone stronger, but by the one bold enough to raise their head while everyone else bows. LL Cool J learned that in 1997, when a name unfamiliar to the public but well known in the underground walked into the studio to record the track 4321. That name was Canibus, a young Jamaican-American rapper with a razor-sharp delivery, extraordinary technique, and an intense hunger to prove himself among legends. At first, this was a golden opportunity for Canibus. Sharing a track with LL Cool J, Method Man Redman, and DMX was a dream come true for any newcomer. No one imagined this collaboration would spark one of the fiercest and most complex rap beefs of the 1990s. But everything began with one line. In his original verse, Canibus rapped, "Yo L, is that a mic on your arm?" Let me borrow that. It seemed harmless, referencing LL's iconic microphone tattoo. But to LL, who saw that tattoo as a symbol of his career, his fight, and his loyalty, it wasn't a joke. He asked Canibus to change the line. Canibus agreed out of respect. But LL, instead of adjusting his own verse, kept in an indirect but unmistakable diss, now taking aim at the very newcomer who had just deferred to him. When the final version of 4321 was released, Canibus felt blindsided. He had backed down. LL had not. The optics made Canibus look both disrespectful and weak. That was when he decided to strike back with a track that would make history. Second Round KO. It opened with one of the coldest lines in hip-hop. The greatest rapper of all time died on March 9th. A shot at LL, who had dubbed himself the G08, and a subtle tribute to the late Notorious B.I.G. But Second Round KO wasn't just a diss track, it was a manifesto. For 3 relentless minutes, Canibus tore into LL's public image, attacking his music, his status in the industry, and what he saw as contradictions between LL's persona and reality. LL responded with "The Ripper Strikes Back," a clever, forceful rebuttal laced with sharp lyricism and symbolic jabs. But this battle wasn't about wordplay, it was about emotion. LL wasn't just defending his name, he was defending an entire value system: respect, seniority, and hierarchy. Canibus, on the other hand, saw that very system as the chains holding back a new generation. The clash became a war between two eras, one trying to preserve the flame it had built, the other trying to burn it down to start fresh. Critics leaned toward Canibus, praising his technique, courage, and audacity in going head-to-head with a still relevant titan. But the public stayed loyal to LL, the figure tied to their childhood, their classics. Second Round KO elevated Canibus to his peak, but it would be a brief one. His career never again matched that moment. As for LL, whether he won or lost, he walked away knowing this was the battle that cost him most: trust, innocence, and the belief that those who once admired you would never turn on you. Over a decade later, in 2014, a powerful image surfaced on social media: LL Cool J and Canibus, standing side by side on stage at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. No grand apology, no nostalgia trip, just a quiet moment. Two men looking out at the crowd, understanding what it all meant. Perhaps that's when LL realized legacy isn't preserved by staying undefeated. It's built by facing every challenge, from rivals, from friends, and from those who once idolized you. And in that way, the pain, the conflict, and the confrontation became the bedrock that shaped a legend. If these stories behind the spotlight truly touch something deep within you, pride, pain, or simply the journey of staying true to yourself in a changing world, don't forget to hit subscribe. Like the video and turn on notifications. We'll continue bringing you the most honest slices of the lives of legends. No embellishment, no judgment, just the moments that shaped them, and perhaps shaped the way we see the world today.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore. Stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.